I'm really happy today that a new era is starting.
There's that sense of optimism, of strong leadership with our new Prime Minister.
I think Mr. Carney is what Canada needs as a whole. Not necessarily Liberal, Conservative, Independent. I think Mark Carney is what Canada needs.
There are people that have joined across the country explicitly who have told me, I've never voted Liberal before, but I'll be voting Liberal this election because of Mark Carney.
I am ready for an election in Beaches East York, and I think we got a fair fighting chance now.
A sampling there of Liberals making their way out of their first caucus after electing a new leader. Mark Carney's win was definitive with 85.9% of the vote. His closest competitor, former Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, who basically started the leadership contest by quitting cabinet, was a distant second with 8% of the vote. An election is likely around the corner. Here's how Carney and Tory leader Pierre Poilievre are framing the choice for voters.
Donald Trump thinks he can weaken us with his plan to divide and conquer. Pierre Poilievre's plan will leave us divided and ready to be conquered. Because a person who worships at the altar of Donald Trump will kneel before him, not stand up to him.
We know Carney will sell out Canada for his personal profit. He's already done it. He's systematically done it his entire time as a corporate insider. Giving the Liberals a fourth term will not change any of that. Carney puts himself first. Conservatives will put Canada first.
All right, let's bring in the front bench to talk about all that. Former senior advisor to the Liberal Ontario governments of Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Mint, Dan Moulton, is here. He's now a partner with Crestview Strategy. Next to him, Shakir Chambers is a vice president at Oyster Group. He worked in Prime Minister Stephen Harper's office before becoming a policy advisor to the International Trade Minister. And rounding us out here in studio, yes, Christmas came early, Kathleen Monk is the former director of communications to the late Jack Layton. She's now the principal owner of Monk & Associates. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to see you all here in studio. I really appreciate it. Dan, yeah, in the flesh. Dan, I will start with you. And I actually have to start last night, right? This massive win, this definitive win for Mark Carney. I mean, I'm sure you were talking to the same people. They thought maybe 70, 74, the most optimistic among them, 86% of the vote. What does that tell you?
I went in last night with my odds at probably around 60%.
Right,
and I would say of my peers, I was probably on the higher end. I think most people thought it might go 2 ballots. I think there was confidence that Carney was going to win and finish the night on top. But when I first heard 80%, I thought I couldn't believe it, right? And obviously later on we found out it was even higher at 86%. So an extraordinarily strong performance, higher than the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister even got in his leadership back in 2013. And so I just say it has sent a message through the party of unity, of coherence. There's no question about his leadership. He has an enormous mandate. For him to have won every riding in the country like this,
even his competitors.
Exactly, to have won 80% at University of Rosedale and in Burlington is a huge achievement. A stat I was quoted today that I really stopped in my tracks by. The Carney team got more individual donations from Canadians through the course of this campaign than their competitors received votes combined. So it was an enormous achievement. I think he's got a really strong mandate to move forward with the party right now.
What do you think Shakir is informing that mandate? Is it primarily, I mean, his own positioning, for sure, in his own resume and stuff, but is it primarily a question of who they think has the best chance in an election?
Yeah, I think they positioned Mark Carney as the only viable option to contrast against Pierre Poilievre and kind of win the next election. But I do question those numbers, right? I mean, we're focusing on 86%, landslide win, but the turnout was 38%. The party was bragging about 400,000 registered Liberals. Only 150,000 actually came out and voted. And I think if you actually look at some of the internal numbers in terms of the votes that they brought out there, look at the Brampton ridings, for example. 6 ridings where, in total, Mark Carney only got 1,500 votes and he won those seats, right? So I think there are some questions there. They might even point to some organizational challenges as well. You look at Quebec, similar trend as well. Not these massive numbers of voters coming out to support Mark Carney. We'll see if this continues as a trend as a general election, but I do think there's some challenges there in terms of organization and pulling out votes despite his landslide win.
Okay, split the difference for us, Kathleen. Are there some challenges, or is it like a slam dunk?
I appreciate Shakira's attempt to rain on Carney's parade on day one. I mean, that's a good partisan for you. But I mean, I think you have to look at a couple other data points. points and the constellation of data points. I mean, the amount of fundraising that Carney did, extraordinary. $4.5 million in just a number of weeks. Those are, in fact, very close to Poilievre kind of like numbers in terms of being able to drive that kind of cash. That's really good. I think that still you have to look at the fact that turnout for this voter, there were more voters here than there were for Justin Trudeau back when he won leadership in 2013. So there's lots of good news in the story. Whether that pans out for the federal election, a whole other story. And that's where I agree. That's where I don't take Dan's side, but I take Shakir's side, that we have to see how this mets out in an actual election. You know, he's got to do a number of things very quickly. He has to attract new candidates. He has to put a team together. I mean, first of all, he just has to be sworn in. And we're hearing, you know, from who I'm talking to today that, you know, he's even having trouble getting some of those gears in motion. That said, what was the most surprising, Dan already touched on it, the fact that Carney took so much from even his competitors. To just be, you know, Chrystia Freeland to wake up to the fact that her own riding, she couldn't even keep her own riding. I think that's got to be pretty disappointing. But I'm hearing from Liberal organizers that they actually did over 2,000 direct real phone calls. Yeah, that's a lot of direct phone calls, not IVR, not automated. These are real live people calling people to try to drive the vote. And so they did have some muscle behind this machine, and they pulled it out last night for sure.
I think, honestly, that is the most helpful part of this leadership process. Not just the mandate that Carney got, but the re-energization of the Liberal mechanics of a campaign.
Enthusiasm drives everything and drives momentum.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that and ask about the prospect of a campaign. How soon do you anticipate, Dan, we could get there? And what are some of the things that we saw today? For example, you know, meeting obviously with Justin Trudeau, the outgoing Prime Minister, to be expected, but the selection of Marco Mendicino, an MP who said he wasn't going to run again for a Toronto riding, now assuming the role, at least on a temporary basis, of Chief of Staff. What's the timeline you're thinking?
Well, I mean, worst kept secret in the city right now is we're going to have an election very soon, right? It is very
safe bet, yeah.
I think it's a very safe bet. There's going to be an election very soon. I could see an election being triggered by the end of next week. I think that certainly looks very likely at this point. And really that is driving a lot of the decision making and how Mark Carney's setting up his office, right? Because you have both a necessity of an operation here at the Prime Minister's office, working with the civil service, Janice Charette, taking on an important leadership role in that transition. But there's an entire campaign operation that needs to take an immediate focus in terms of getting an election up off the ground. And I think the reality is we're probably going to see a model followed by the Mark Carney campaign that Doug Ford really laid out in the recent provincial election, which is maximizing the political opportunity that's been presented by Donald Trump and these tariffs. And a bit of campaign is governing, right? Like, I think we're going to see them put into action very fast a governing approach that's also a campaign, right? And I think
trips to Washington, Doug Ford, right?
I'm sure that's in their considerations right now, and they're thinking about how do we present a plan to Canadians to deal with the crisis that we're in, which is existential in the minds of Canadians. And clearly, a lot of people in this country think Mark Carney is up to the job dealing with it. Public opinion polls are becoming more and more clear about how Canadians feel he is prepared for that job. And so I think it would be wise of him politically to put the question to Canadians as fast as possible. Do you think I'm the guy to deal with this, Mark Carney, or do you want Pierre Poilievre? And I think less and less people than 6 months ago are going to make a choice to vote for Liberals.
I think we're all convinced that question will be put to Canadians pretty soon. Shakir, talk a little bit, if you could, and we heard that clip from the leader of the Conservatives about the way in which the Conservatives will approach exactly what Dan laid out, particularly if Mark Carney has the additional kind of asset or leverage of being able to govern and campaign.
Yeah, listen, I think the Conservatives are obviously focused on the Trump factor and the tariff factor, but I think they want folks to remember why we had the leadership race in the first place, right? There were policies put in place, even in the pre-tariff world, that people weren't happy about. Let's not forget. And Mark Carney's a guy who, when he started his leadership campaign, he was very clear. I am not a politician, so I'm going to rely on my team to help me govern. Who is his team? His team are former Trudeau cabinet ministers. His backroom operatives are former Trudeau backroom operatives. And I think Pierre and his team are trying to create that through line between Justin Trudeau and Mark Carney, and hoping that it convinces Canadians that, you know what, it's just another 4 years of the Liberal Party putting forth policies that you didn't like in the first place. We'll see how convincing and persuasive that is, but that's going to be the messaging moving forward.
Do you have a sense, Kathleen, of how convincing it might be or what challenges it might face?
Yeah, it was interesting. There's some new questions that were thrown at Pierre Poilievre today in his scrum today. You know, questions of what is your diplomatic experience? What is your business experience? And that really challenging him to explain that. I think those answers weren't as sharp as some of his other answers, or not as canned as they normally are. So he's got to polish up that. I do think that, and I've said this a couple times in the show, that I do think pushing back to Canadians, don't give them another fourth mandate, is a strong message. I think if you tested that would resonate with people, that maybe Liberals don't deserve a fourth try. But listen, all of the leaders have a lot of work to to do, including my leader, Jagmeet Singh, who's not resonating right now with Canadians. He cannot punch through. This tariff discussion is not helpful to him. Certainly some of the provincial premiers that are Social Democrat, that are New Democrat in parties and affiliation, whether that's Wab Kinew or Eby, are doing better. But I think that even our leader has to do a lot of work in terms of what they're going to spell out for the next election.